I'm Don Howell, and I'm going to be giving a brief lecture on the inclusion of the Gentiles in God's redemptive plan from Ephesians chapter 2 for the Mission of God course. The book of Ephesians is one of Paul's most important letters because it is where he sets forth his doctrine of the church, his ecclesiology. And the passage that I'm going to be reading in just a few moments is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11 through 3:6, which is where he sets forth his understanding of the church as a new man, a new covenant community, a spirit-formed creation of God composed of both Jew and Gentile, based on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But before that, I want to set this passage in the context of God's overall plan of redemptive history and give a little bit of historical context. We go back to Genesis 1 through 11, and God is addressing himself to the nations, of course beginning with Adam and Eve, the first couple who were created in his image, and in that covenant of marriage and in that first family, God gives them a mandate to multiply and fill the earth with those who bear his image and who will be faithful stewards of the wonderful created world in which they have been placed. But of course in Genesis chapter 3 we have the fall of man, and then the corruption of the nations that follows, the flood, and then the Tower of Babel incident where man has fully rebelled against that original mandate and is seeking to establish a humanistic society devoid of trust and faith in God's promises. So in Genesis chapter 12, we have a turning point as God turns away from those nations who have rebelled against him, and he focuses upon one man. That man is Abraham. And with Abraham, he makes a covenant. He offers a number of promises. It's a unilateral, declarative covenant. He says, I will, several times, makes a number of promises, of which 3 are foundational. The first is the promise of a seed. He's going to bring from Abraham's body a son, and from that son will come a family, and from that family will come a nation. So the promise of a seed. The second promise is the promise of a land. He promises a piece of real estate, the land of Canaan, that his descendants are going to inherit and live out their covenant obligations under the Mosaic law that will be mediated through Moses, where they live out the 10 Commandments and their other obligations as God's people on the earth. And then thirdly is the climactic promise of the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3. In you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now from Abraham comes a family. From that family comes a people. They are tested and refined in Egypt. They are brought out in the Exodus event, are given the law, enter into the land of Canaan, and now they become a nation with their own constitution. And from there, for the next approximately 1,000 years, from Abraham to Moses, these Jews, these Hebrews, these Israelites are going to be God's people on the earth who mediate God's blessings and who proclaim the glory and majesty of the one true God of all the earth. First in the tabernacle and then in the temple, God's presence is manifest among this people. And the golden age, of course, eventually arrives with David and Solomon as they are prosperous, filling that land of Judea and ruled by a righteous ruler who is a man after God's heart. But then David's son Solomon turns away to idolatry, and that begins a series of domino effects where the nation breaks apart. First, the northern kingdom is swept away, then the southern kingdom of Judea is destroyed by the Babylonians, the nation is taken into exile, and although there's a small remnant of believers that come back under Zerubbabel and then Ezra, Nehemiah, and there's a small remnant back in the land, they are no longer a theocracy. There's a small temple that has been rebuilt, but it is a nation that is now under the domination of foreign powers, and At the end of the Old Testament, the voice of the prophets ceases, and you have the intertestamental period of silence. But then we come to the New Testament, which opens Matthew 1:1 like this: Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the son of Abraham. Here's the one now whom God is going to fulfill those promises to Abraham. Though he's been narrowing his focus on that remnant, and prophecy has ceased for a period of time, now the promises of the Old Testament are going to reach fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And the centripetal mission of the Old Testament, to come and see, to come to Jerusalem and see the glory of God in the Jerusalem temple, now is going to shift to a centrifugal mission through Jesus and his apostles and those generations of churches that are planted by Peter and Paul, to go and tell the nations of the work of God's redeeming grace through Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection. So now we come to Ephesians chapter 2, and I want to read Ephesians 2:11 through 14, the first paragraph where Paul begins to expound this new covenant transformation that has taken place through the death and resurrection of Christ. Remember that at one time you, Gentiles in the flesh, call the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands. Remember that at that time you were separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments and ordinances. In the former stage of salvation history, until the coming of Christ, these uncovenanted Gentiles were alienated. They were separated and strangers from the covenants of promise. They did not have a true knowledge of God, and they were far off. But in the death and resurrection of Christ, through his redeeming blood, they have been brought near and have been given access and actually have been made one with all believers. Jewish and Gentile believers have been made one as that dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile has been broken down. This dividing wall between Jew and Gentile that we see in the former stage of salvation history may well refer to the balustrade or fence that separated the outer court of the Gentiles from the inner court of Israel. No uncircumcised Gentile could enter the court of Israel beyond that balustrade or dividing wall. And Paul says God has now broken down that dividing wall, and there is full access to the very presence of God through the death and resurrection of Christ. It may also be referring to the inner curtain, the shielding curtain between the Holy of Holies and the holy place. God's presence was in that inner chamber, above the Ark of the Covenant, between the cherubim. But now that veil has been rent, it has been torn from top to bottom, and there is full access. No longer does the Mosaic law with its ordinances and commands and decrees operate as the governing charter for God's people. That has now been removed as the governing constitution for the new covenant people of God. So he has shattered the wall, broken down the hostility between Jew and Gentile, and created access for the Gentiles into God's presence. The second thing he says in this passage is that by shattering the wall, God has created one new man, a new community. So let me read verses 15 to 21. That he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, and might reconcile both Jew and Gentile to God in one body through the cross, killing the hostility. He now has preached peace to you who are far off and peace to you who are near. Through him we both, Jew and Gentile, have access in one Spirit to the Father. So then, you Gentiles are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. So the Old Testament temple was a type, a foreshadowing, pointing to something beyond itself, a spirit-formed temple of God's people, composed of all who are redeemed by the blood of Christ, Jew and Gentile, indwelt by the Spirit, and now forming a new covenant community, a holy temple, as it were, being built together as a dwelling place for God by His Spirit. But not only has He shattered the wall of division between Jew and Gentile, not only has He united the two into one new body, He now, in the final paragraph of this section, calls the church a mystery in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. 3 times Paul says that this new community of faith is a mystery, not made known in past times, but now revealed to him. It is a mystery of Christ, not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed to His holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 5. Now, Gentile salvation was prophesied by the Old Testament prophets. The blessing of the nations is part of the Abrahamic covenant. Isaiah looks forward to a day when light will shine upon the Gentiles, as all the prophets do. But Paul says there is a dimension here that is mysterious. It has been hidden, secreted away in the counsels of God until the time of disclosure, which is now. And now in this new covenant, the mystery unfolds that not only are Gentiles to be redeemed, but they are to be co-heirs, co-partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus, fellow heirs of the covenant, and full-fledged members of this community, so that there is no division anymore between Jew and Gentile. Ethnic, gender, age, socioeconomic kinds of distinctions no longer apply to this new covenant community. And now it is a centrifugal mission of going out and telling the good news of Christ having died and been raised again from the dead to provide redemption for all people by His grace through faith to all the nations. This is the centrifugal mission of the church. This is the mission of God. And we are called to be partners, sharers with God in His mission of redemption to the nations.